Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, and welcome to our book discussion webinar. Today, we are going to discuss book titled The Connection World, The Future of ASEAN Capitalism by Simon Commander and Saul Estrin. I am Fajar Hirawan. I'm a head of economics department here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I will become a moderator for today's session. Talking about this book, I think this book explores the fascinating world of ASEAN capitalism and how it has evolved over time. It takes a deep dive into the various economic, social, and political factors that have shaped the region's business landscape and offers insight into what the future might hold. This book is a thought-provoking analysis of the role of connection and network in shaping the futures of capitalism in Asia. It challenges a conventional wisdom and sheds new light on how businesses, governments, and societies in the region operate. We are honored to have the authors, Professor Simon Commander and also Professor Saul Estrin with us today. And also we have a discussant, Dr. Raymond Atje, who will share his insight and perspective on the book. We hope that through this discussion, we can gain a deeper understanding of the opportunities and challenges facing ASEAN's economy and how we can navigate them to build a more prosperous and sustainable future. Before we begin, I would like to introduce, or I would like to read a profile of the authors. First, Professor Simon Commander, or perhaps I can call you Simon. Simon Commander received his Bachelor of Arts from Oxford University in 1975 and his PhD from Cambridge University in 1980. He worked for 15 years at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., starting in 1988. And subsequently, he has been senior advisor at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and a director of the Center of New and Emerging Markets at London Business School. He is currently a professor at the IE Business School or Instituto de Empresa Business School in Madrid and managing partner at Altura Partners. And I believe that he has published he has published so many articles and books and also the working papers. His research interests include labor economics, income determination, inflation, comparative economic systems, and also economic policy. I also want to read a brief profile about Professor Saul Estrin. Saul Estrin is an Emeritus Professor of Managerial Economics and Strategy and the founding head of the Department of Management. He was formerly a Deco Professor of Business and Society at the London Business School, where he was the director of the CSIS Middle Europe Center and research director of the Center for New and Emerging Markets. At the London School of Economics, he is affiliated with the Center for Economic Performance and was the research director of the Entrepreneurship Institute. Perhaps, Professor Saul has a long, research related to the microeconomics, the comparative economic systems, and also related to the labor management, spending, and social economy. So before we start, I would like to remind everyone here to keep their microphones muted throughout the session. Perhaps, we are going to give a chance to Simon and Saul to present or to share their insight about the book. And I believe that there are several sections that probably will be highlighted by Simon and Saul. Perhaps, talking about the networks and hierarchies in Asia, the political economy of connection capitalism, perhaps, want to see what is the futures of the connection capitalism. Without further ado, let's get started, and I will give an opportunity to Simon and Saul to share your thoughts regarding your book. Please, Simon, the screen and time is yours.
Thank you very much, Fajar. It's really a great pleasure, honor to be with you. And thanks to CSIS and yourselves and your colleagues for hosting this webinar about the book. Our book is called The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, and it was published at the end of last year by Cambridge University Press, although it came out only in North America early this year. And our book is, and we're going to basically organize the presentation in two parts. I'll take the first bit and Saul will take the second. And we, as you can see, have a slideshow, which we have up on screen. So I'm going to start off by, in a sense, summarizing the broad arguments that we have in our book. Look, put it this way, the book doesn't ask small questions. And whether we answer these rather large, bold questions that we pose, well, is for you to decide. First slide, please, Saul. And what we're looking at is, what are the factors that have made Asia the great success story of the last 50 years? Are those features and characteristics likely to make Asia the great success story of this century, the 21st? Or are the fragilities and other aspects likely to get in the way? So those are the big questions we ask. Now, the starting point is that Asia's extraordinarily impressive growth, which has spilled across countries and sub-regions at different levels of income and the like, has actually been achieved through the applications of policies and business configurations that are rather different from what we observe in the so-called rich or advanced world, even during the rich and the advanced world's rise up the income ladder. And what I mean by this is not just the application of activist vertical industrial policy, perhaps best indicated by what has gone on over the last 50, 60 years in South Korea, but also the application of what we call tacit public or industrial policy, the support of the state for large business groups. And that's the second and unusual aspect, that the really center ground of these economies is not occupied by, as you would find in North America or in Europe for the most part, standalone businesses, but by business groups. And these are groups of businesses with many, many interests, and they're often family controlled. And I'll come back to that in a while. And this combination of public industrial policy, tacit and explicit, along with the reliance on business groups, has actually, we argued, been an important feature behind Asia's success by coordinating outcomes and helping to build a lot of the supportive infrastructure and other features essential to growth. Now, behind these connections, however, lie what we term networks of links running between business and politicians. And these links are both pervasive and highly persistent. Once established, they don't tend to go away. They tend to reform sometimes or recombine, but they are extraordinarily pervasive and sticky. And these links or ties really create enormous amounts of privileged access and high returns to that access. And this is, in short, what we term the connections world. So to summarize very briefly, this connections world has not been a barrier to Asia's growth, not a bit of it. In fact, we argue it has been a feature that has aided growth. But looking forward, well, that's another matter, and we'll come to that very shortly. Next slide, please, Saul. Now, what are the components of this connections world? Well, at the apex sit really two groups, big groups. They're political parties, individual politicians, their businesses, and as I mentioned already, in particular, business groups. And these two sets of entities or persons interact in a highly transactional way. They look for benefits for either side. The politicians look to get campaign contributions in the democracies, or jobs for them or their family, or jobs for their constituents in politically important regions or politically important moments. And in that respect, they're not an awful lot different from what goes on in the US or in other countries. But the intensity of what they do and the pervasiveness of it probably operates at quite a different level. Now, firms, companies, look to politicians for protection from foreign or domestic competition. They look to gain subsidies. They look to gain loans, particularly from state-owned banks, because state-owned banks, after all, are very susceptible to commands issued by politicians. They look for public sector contracts, and they want permits or licenses, because in most emerging market economies, permits and licenses are extremely important, even if in principle, the state has withdrawn from much of economic activity. So just to give an example, in India, it's not just that you need a permit or license if you're in telecoms, a regulated industry, or mining. You need, by and large, permits or licenses for most sorts of activity. And that's where this interaction comes in place. Next slide, please. Now, these networks are highly adaptive, purposive, and really go way beyond what has often been written about, which is cronyism. Now, a great deal of interest has been written about the era of cronyism of Suharto in Indonesia. More recently, for instance, relative to China, Ming Jinpei's excellent book on China's crony capitalism and the like. But we take a different approach. This is not really about I having a connection to politician X or Saul having a connection to politician Y. This is about whole networks and complex ties that run between politicians, political parties, and businesses, notably business groups. And these webs of connections, we argue, cut across these various geographies, cut across these different income level countries, and have very common ways of operating. Now, for sure, they are influenced by the political and institutional format of each country. Next slide, please. And in this slide, you can see, in this slide, you can see two network maps that we draw. In the book, we have network maps for each of the countries we cover in the book. And by the way, the countries we cover in Asia in the book are all so-called middle-income countries of Asia. So we're not dealing with Laos or Cambodia or Nepal. We're dealing only with them. Now, on the left facing the screen, it's no surprise to know that that is the network of connections in China using the data set that we have. And the reason is, obviously, there's one unique party at the heart of the Cyclops Eye, and out of it are links to the functionaries or members of the party. And around them are a cluster of the blue, which are state-owned enterprises, of which there are still a large number in China, but also the green that are private enterprises, and the black nodes, which are private individuals. Now, it should be mentioned that in these maps, using a proprietary data set that we have of political connections, the scaling is not by the size of the entity, say. So the party in the middle is not large because it is a party. It is simply large because it's scaled by the number of connections that that party has. And obviously, those connections are a large number. On the right-hand side, we have India, which obviously has a different political system. You have the two main parties there, BJP and Congress, and then you have a whole host of regional political parties. You have some state-owned enterprises, much less in number than in China, and you also have a whole bunch of state-owned private enterprises and private individuals. So political systems, institutional formats matter, but what is so interesting is that if we'd done these sorts of maps, hypothetically that is, for the 1970s or 80s, by and large, most of the connections would have run between political party or state and the state-owned enterprise sector and the public sector. Right now, irrespective of the country, the main players and the main entities in this are not just, on the one hand, are the political parties and politicians, but on the other hand, it's many private enterprises and private individuals. And that is a sea change in the operation of these economies over time. Next slide, please, Saul. Now, let me turn to the business part, business organization in the connections world. Obviously, there's state-owned enterprises there. They're not trivial in number. They're mostly underperforming, as we know from other studies, including Saul's excellent work. But it's not just that state-owned enterprises are highly politicized. They're actually a declining part of just about all of these economies. And what is actually over time become much more important are these business groups. Now, they're not the same as conglomerates in the so-called advanced economies. Business groups are mostly family, often dynastic, i.e. several generations. They're often very diversified. They do enormous numbers of things. They can be in telecoms, they can be in mining, they can be in manufacturing of some variety or the other, they can be in services and so on. And once they get established and get a foothold, the final point I want to make on that is they tend to be very persistent. And this is no better illustrated than by the history of Indonesia, where many of the major business groups were formed in the Suharto era and still exist to this day. In fact, the change of regime really did not see a big realignment or even disappearance of those groups, such as Salim, that were particularly closely associated with the autocratic regime that had preceded the current arrangements, i.e. Suharto. Now, in these business groups, they tend to have pyramid-like structures, which allow their owners far higher levels of control than would be warranted, at least formally speaking, by their levels of actual ownership. The second, of course, and related point is that minority shareholders tend to get the wrong end of the stick, as we say in English. They tend to be disadvantaged. These structures facilitate their owners, their controllers, as it were, to tunnel resources around the group, which can be both good and bad. But it also means, of course, they have high degrees of discretion. And finally, these pyramid-like complex structures are really very good at deterring what we call predators. And predators may be other businesses wanting to take them over, but may also be politicians who want to expropriate them, or if they've fallen out with them, punish them in inverted commas in some way. Next slide, please. Now, business groups have been around in Asia for a long time, and there have been many articles, books written about why. Part of it is put down to sociology, Asian families, values, and so on. But in the economics literature, the main arguments for why business groups exist come down to what are called, following Ronald Coase and others, missing or incomplete markets. Now, business groups might be, in that context, useful for addressing a missing or incomplete market for capital. Say financial markets are relatively backward. It might be useful for addressing the shortage of skilled managers, if that indeed is a feature of the labor market in a particular economy. But having said that, it is very clear that as Asia has grown and developed, both capital and managerial and other markets have become not only less missing and less incomplete, but ironically, business groups have, if anything, become stronger and more prevalent. So they've gone in the other direction from what might have been predicted. And we argue, therefore, that this sort of broad brush argument doesn't really work in explaining why business groups are so prevalent and so sticky or persistent. We argue in the book that business groups are around so much because they are an ideally suited format for connecting to politicians, and they suit not only the business groups themselves, but also suit the politicians, both for good and bad. I've already mentioned that once they get established, business groups tend to be highly persistent. But let me point to another feature, which we'll come back to later in the presentation, which is that once they get established, business groups are remarkably good at concentrating market and business power unto themselves, but also wealth. Just to give you an example of one of the most successful family dynastic business groups in Asia, Samsung. Samsung now accounts for around 22% of South Korea's GDP. And the son of Samsung's founder, who died a few years ago, left an estate of over 21 billion. In Thailand, one of the main families there, the Hirawan extended family, now has a wealth of 24, 25 billion. And this has been a major feature of the last 20, 25 years. Not only the increase in wealth generally, but also in the concentration of wealth. Next slide, please. Now, if, as we argue in the book, the connections world has been, in a sense, good for Asia, it certainly has not been an impediment to its growth, and in certain respects has been an important support for Asia's growth. Looking forward, that's much less likely to be the case. And we argue that the connections world has actually become not only more entrenched, which is contrary to the arguments of missing or incomplete markets, as I've already mentioned, but in this entrenchment that has gone on, there are a bunch of problems and fallibilities that have come to the surface and are likely to themselves persist and need addressing. The first is the attenuation or the limitation of competition, which in turn constrains productivity. And that's really a very major feature. And in the next part of the presentation, Saul will talk about that in more detail. The second, which is potentially, in a sense, even more explosive, certainly politically, is that the connections world really has not been at all good at generating so-called good jobs. What do I mean by good jobs? I mean high productivity, stable, non-precarious jobs with good wages. The connections world has really been lousy at doing this, despite what the politicians have talked about. The third fallibility is the connections world does not look to be the best sort of place for sustaining a shift towards innovation. And innovation is what Asia is going to need in the future, because simply relying on the greater application of capital and labor, which has been the predominant growth story up till now, that will not be feasible in the future. And it already is not feasible in several countries, such as China, South Korea, and Malaysia, and the like. But that's also going to be a spreading phenomenon. And finally, as I mentioned, the connections world gives rise to tremendous inequalities in wealth, in income, and ultimately will pose political risks of a moderately predictable nature. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Saul, who's going to start with talking about the competitive dimensions of the connections world and how this can be addressed. Over to you, Saul.
Thank you, Simon. My part of the presentation is going to be really about two things. The first is what's the impact of the connections world on the economies of Asia, and I'm going to really unpack the points that Simon's been making about competition and the market structure, about the labour market, and about innovation. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is going to be about what Asian governments, what policymakers might be able to do to try and address the problems that we are highlighting in this book. So, beginning with competition, I think it's quite important to realize, because Simon's been concentrating quite heavily on quite rightly on business groups and the industrial side, but just to return to the connections world concept, the connections world is a political economy equilibrium, which operates between the businesses on the one hand, primarily these business groups, and politicians on the other hand, and government on the other hand. And it's really quite important to see this as an equilibrium in which neither party has a real reason to change the existing structures. Now, once we start viewing competition through that lens, you immediately see that neither the business groups nor the politicians are really interested at all in allowing new firm entry. And they've got a lot of capacity to prevent new firm entry. Firms, because of their very great market power, which I'm going to come to in a minute, and governments through various forms of regulation, including restricting foreign competition, restricting FDI, or simply regulating and limiting the possibility for new entrants. So what we're seeing here is an environment in which entry barriers for new firms, domestic or foreign, are typically rather high, that those barriers can be economic barriers, cost base, or they could be regulatory barriers, and it is highly likely that the government and the business groups will work in tandem to ensure that competition is limited. At the same time, neither party has very great interest in exit. That is to say, the government will be worried about exit because of the loss of jobs and prestige, and business groups may be worried, there's a lot of evidence for this, may be worried about losing their position across the economy and their standing relative to other business groups, or their standing with the government if they're forced to close various elements, and therefore they may choose to use their financial resources and their ability to transfer financially across the group to maintain subsidiaries, affiliates that otherwise would have closed. So what we're seeing is the type of what Schumpeter called creative destruction, where we have innovation creating new firms, and the new firms take resources primarily from the bankruptcy or disruption, as it's now called, of old firms. These processes, which are so important to the development of the economy, can be quite heavily constrained by the operation of the connections world. Now, let's see if we can give you some data on this type of issue, on limits of competition. Now, it's very important to realize that when we're talking about attenuation and competition, we're talking about two different things. When we think of attenuation of competition in a traditional market economy, we're interested in market power in a market. If you look at how competition authorities work, they're basically interested in whether a firm has excessive market power, which it could abuse to, for example, raise prices and damage the welfare of consumers. And this tends to be measured by whether the firm has a large market share, let's say 20 or 30%. Right? Now, the whole point about business groups is they construct firms which sprawl across many sectors. We've been doing some work on India, and what they suggest is that the business groups can operate in 50, 100, even in some cases 150 sectors simultaneously. So it's clearly important not only to think about the market power of firms within the sector, but their market power in the economy as a whole, what we term overall concentration. And let's have a little look at data on that. Now, if we look at the United States, as I'm sure you're all aware, the four largest firms, the tech firms, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook, for example, the 5 largest firms, each of them have very big market shares. Google, for example, has something like a 60% market share in search. Facebook, something like 70% in social connections. Now, despite that very high market share in their markets, when you add them up and look at their overall concentration, even those giants are very small relative to the overall market economy of the United States. So their market share of the top 5 firms is about 3%, and of the top 10 firms is less than 4%. And that would be typical of many Western countries. But when we look at the overall market share in the Asian economies, we see a very different picture. Countries like South Korea, around 30% of GDP is under the control of 5 firms. And if we look at even the giant countries like India and China with vast GDPs, right, you'll immediately see that the overall concentration ratio is over 10%, 3 or 4 times the American rate. Interestingly, this problem of overall concentration seems to be less marked in Indonesia than in other Asian economies. It's not that it's not high, it's still more than double the US level, but it's not as high as we're seeing in some of the Asian economies. So, turning to the second problem, employment. Just to remind you, and I'm sure you're very well aware of this in the Indonesian context, all of Asia has a huge employment challenge because essentially the demography has been generating very rapid growth in the population, and there's a large population of young people, and the market economy that is not generating sufficient good jobs to employ them all. So there's the fundamental problem that I think we would like to highlight about the way the connections world that impacts the labour market is not that business groups do not create good jobs. In fact, business groups do create good jobs. By good jobs, we mean jobs with high levels of productivity and which are well paid. They do create good jobs, but in fact, they create very few of them. After all, what I've just shown in the previous slide is business groups are very highly monopolistic, and the one thing we know about monopolists is that they essentially restrict output and by implication restrict employment, and that's exactly what we see. So business groups create a small number of good jobs and then operate essentially through supply chains with smaller firms, very small firms typically, right? And in Asia, the specifics of this is many of those firms are informal. And the informal sector, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a sector which does not create good jobs. The productivity in the informal sector is very low, wages are low, and there's very high levels of insecurity. So while the share of business groups in GDP is rather high in most Asian economies, the share of employment of business groups is much lower, perhaps as much as a tenth below the share of output. And that's telling you essentially that business groups are not creating employment in line with their product market power, and they're pushing employment out to the informal sector. And what this means is we see a missing middle of firms. You've got a small number of large, highly productive firms with good jobs, a huge number of relatively small or tiny firms with low productivity and not very good jobs, and the middle of medium-sized firms that might grow to become larger firms if the situation was more competitive is essentially missing, is absent. And so the connections world is distorting the operating of both the product market and the labour market. What about innovation? Now, innovation is a very important thing for Asia, as I'm sure you're all well aware. Asia has been growing until now, primarily, not entirely, but primarily through what's known as extensive growth, that is the shifting of labor and capital resources using known technologies or previously developed technologies. Sometimes these have to be adapted quite a lot for the local context, but nonetheless, there's not sort of high science-based innovation for the most part driving Asian growth. Now, as demography is changing, and birth rates have come right down, particularly say in China, but not only in China by any means, Asia has to start thinking about how to shift to intensive growth, to growth based on innovation. And this is going to become an increasing challenge in the next upcoming decades. So, and it's a very important question for the future. How good is this business group structure for innovation? As Simon argued before, the business group structure is really a very good way of coordinating between government and firms with industrial policy, and is also a very good way of concentrating resources for growth. So it's a very good mechanism for extensive growth, but is it a good mechanism for intensive growth? Actually, our argument here is quite nuanced. It's not completely obvious that business groups are a bad way of going for innovation. The concentration of resources and their ability to attract resources from government means that perhaps they could stimulate innovation. There's some theory by people like Philippe Agnon that argues that even with monopolistic competition, the leading edge companies will be innovating to escape that competition. And we do see that to some extent if we think of some of the Indian companies like the Tata Brothers or Infosys that are innovating quite, or in China, of course, competition to innovate, to escape competition. So there are reasons to think that innovation may be feasible in the connections world, but there are really some worries about it as well. The pyramidal structures allow resources to be shifted around, but they're not necessarily shifted around to the benefit of innovation. They're shifted around to benefit family owners. And those family owners are primarily interested in entrenchment and their relationships with the government and with other business groups, as I've argued before. And so that is not necessarily consistent with innovation at all. Perhaps the most important 2 points are, however, that the high levels of market power and political connections are likely to lead to rent seeking. And we see increasingly that business groups are turning to rent seeking as an activity. Most recently, the Adani's behavior in India seems to be almost a textbook of this, but we also see many examples in places like Sri Lanka. At the same time, most of the researchers on entrepreneurship and innovation believe that entry and exit is critical to innovation. And as we've seen, the way the connections world operates highly restricts the possibilities for entry and exit. So overall, we're probably on balance pessimistic about innovation. This is not to say that business groups themselves won't innovate. We've actually done work ourselves that show that business groups innovate more the non-affiliates. Our argument is that business groups might hold back innovation in the aggregate because they crowd out the non-affiliated firms in terms of capital markets, or in terms of resources for science and development, or in terms of entry into markets and their ability to undertake trial and error. What's the evidence on this? Well, we can look at, for example, WIPO's Global Innovation Index. And what we've done here is we've constructed, using data from all the countries in the world for which data is available, about 112, we've looked at the relationship between R&D spending, which is an indicator of innovative activity in a country, and GDP per capita. And what we see is that, of course, GDP per capita there's a positive correlation between R&D spending and GDP per capita. And most Asian countries are more or less where you'd expect them to be. There's only one outstandingly successful country relative to the global norm in Asia in terms of innovation using this data, and that's South Korea, although China is rising. And there are several countries, unfortunately, I'm afraid Indonesia is one of them, that are punching somewhat below their weight in this area. I won't go into much more detail, but we can see exactly the same results vis-a-vis patents. Only really South Korea is well ahead in terms of its patenting ability. So where does that leave us? I think we may want to throw this much of this open question to the discussion. We're not saying that the prospects for Asia are poor. What we're saying is that Asia has had a model of growth based around the connections world, which is likely not to serve the areas, the region, so well going forward as it has served it looking backwards. Moreover, it will not fade away naturally because it is entrenched. It's a political economy equilibrium. And this means that for the connection, for growth to really, for us to be confident that growth can continue going forward, you're going to need explicit policies to accelerate the disappearance or transformation of business groups and to limit the incentives for politicians to leverage their connections. And we essentially provide a number of suggestions here, and I'd like to talk about this more in the discussion. We propose strengthening corporate governance in such a way as to prevent the dominance of the dynasties in the business groups. We propose the use of prohibitions. This is essentially how countries like the United States and the UK got rid of the business groups that they had going back to the 1930s, by essentially limiting the pyramids, by preventing the sorts of holding company financial activities. And this has begun to be followed indeed in countries like South Korea and India. And we also propose various forms of taxation. You can read it here. I think we will be most hopeful about the possibilities of taxation based on inheritance tax, because very high tax rates on inheritance essentially forces the dynasties to sell their stakes. And this seems to be one of the areas that South Korea in particular, which is perhaps the country in the region most aware of these issues, this seems to be the way they're trying to address it. And finally, obviously, we can talk more about competition policy. It's clearly got to be beefed up. We would propose in particular competition policy relating to overall concentration rather than just a market power. And finally, we really need greater transparency on the political side. The connections world is a two-sided thing, and we mustn't only focus on policies towards business groups. We must also think about the political structures. And we propose things like asset and interest declarations for politicians and audits for public spending and rules for political donations. I'm sorry I went on quite a long time, but I wanted to try and cover these areas, analytical areas in some depth. But I'd now like to hand over to back to the chair.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Saul, and also thank you, Simon, for the inspiring slides. And perhaps the audience, I think it will be better if you could read the book directly, and perhaps this is a good chance for you to at least to know what the books can offer. And I believe that the contents that we are discussing right now could become a brief introduction to what you are going to read later on. But perhaps you can also could find it somewhere in the Amazon and also in the in the other bookstores that are available in your country. Okay, so I think the things that I highlighted here, perhaps it's quite interesting when Simon mentions that the definition of the connection world, as Simon defines a connection world as a type that create and facilitate privilege, access, and return. And the things that I highlighted based on Saul's presentation, it's quite interesting and it's quite surprising that the business group tend to hold back the innovation in aggregate. But perhaps before we go further, to discuss further about the contents of the book during the Q&A session, I think I will give an opportunity to Dr. Raymond Atje, the Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Economics here at the CSIS. But before Dr. Raymond, start to share some thoughts regarding the book, I want to introduce Dr. Raymond's profile first. Dr. Raymond basically is a former head of Department of Economics here at CSIS. I still remember that when I joined the CSIS, Dr. Raymond is the head of the department back in 2006. And Dr. Raymond did his PhD degree in economics from New York University, NYU, United States. And he also got his master's degree in economics from Stanford University. His bachelor degree, surprisingly, coming from the engineering, major from the Bandung Institute of Technology. So without further ado, I will give an opportunity to Dr. Raymond to share his insight regarding the book. And before I give an opportunity, I will remind all the audience to join us through YouTube or Zoom. If you want to ask a question, please, type your questions in the Q&A section or, in the message box. Or if you want to, ask directly to Simon and Saul, you can raise your hand and I will give you an opportunity to ask directly to Simon and Saul after Dr. Raymond's presentation. Dr. Raymond, the screen and time is yours.
Thank you, Fajar. And thank you, Simon and Saul, for the excellent presentation. I learned a lot from that. I haven't read the book, so my commentary is actually based on PowerPoint that you sent to us before. So I may miss the interpretation of the what you will call the connection world. In your presentation, you pointed out two distinctive features of Asian capitalism. That is the prevalence of family-owned business groups, and the second is the pervasiveness of what you define as connection world, namely the relationship between political parties and politicians on the one hand, and business groups on the other. You also argued that in addition of being family-owned, the business groups are very persistent in Asia. It may be argued, however, the connection world is actually quite pervasive, not only in Asia, but in other parts of the world. The form and the degree of the existing connection world depends on, among other things, the prevailing institution in the country. That is one reason why connection world often changes after the severe crisis. It is quite natural for companies or business groups to seek favor from the country's government. The government is the domestic largest potential customers in the country. The government procures various products in large volume and initiates various projects every year. Companies and business groups are therefore competing to win government procurement contracts to supply the government with products and undertake the government projects. The government also determines the tax subsidies quota, etc. In short, in other words, the government set the country's economic policy, and in this case, companies and business groups are trying to influence the government policies to their advantage. And it also happened in other world, in developed countries. In the United States, for example, Congress lobbied the Congress or hire lobbyists to lobby the government to get favor from the government. In countries where protection of property rights is weak, business also tend to gravitate toward the government to prevent any unexpected and arbitrary closure or expropriation of their business. Russia is a case in point. Because of Russia-Ukraine war, we see an interesting event that there are so many oligarchs that are actually sanctioned by the Western countries. But why did they gravitate towards Putin? Not necessarily because they wanted to become a Putin's cronies. One explanation is to ensure that they could continue to doing business in Russia unhindered. In early 2000, Michael Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia, who owned oil companies named Yukos. But soon he fell out of favor with Putin, presumably because he entertained the idea of entering the business politics. In 2003, Yukos was taken over by the state, and Khodorkovsky was sent to prison for fraud. As I mentioned earlier, what distinguishes Asia from the rest of the world is the prevalence of business groups in Asia. But even within Asia, there are differences in the form and the sort of these business groups and the connecting worlds that they operate in. In South Korea, for example, chaebols were once regarded as agents of development, are now considered as an obstacle for further economic development. One interesting fact regarding chaebols' transformation into a large business is that it was the government initiative, especially during the Park Chung-hee presidency, to provide preferential loans to chaebols with condition that they have to export. The government also secured domestic market for them. Note, however, that government assistance to chaebol were not open-ended. Now, as the government wants to encourage the development of startups, chaebols are seen as an impediment to the creativity and innovation because they form as a barrier to entry into the industry. In addition, the close relationship between the government and chaebols fostered corruption as well. 3 former presidents have been implicated as having received bribes during their tenures. Chun Do-hwan, No Tae-woo, and Park Chung-hee. In Indonesia, Suharto was accused of fostering cronyism during his presidency. Notwithstanding the allegation, Indonesia's economy managed to grow 7% per annum from 1970s to 1977. It may have been a result of Suharto's appointing technocrats and professionals to manage the economy during the most part of his presidency. To his credit, the government had also used oil money wisely to, among other things, build schools and other infrastructure projects such as irrigation. When oil price plunged in the early 1980s, the government was forced to initiate liberalization reforms by beginning in 1986 and switch from hitherto import substitution policy approach to export-oriented manufacturing-led development. During the period under consideration, the level of poverty fell substantially from 56.6% in 1970 to 11.3% in 1996. During the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia experienced severe economic and political crisis that led to significant institutional changes. Some of the country's business groups survived, albeit much slimmer, while the new business groups emerged. The subsequent president introduced new laws that govern the country's economy, such as competition law and a more decentralized government. Accordingly, the relationship between the government and business groups also changed. In short, connection words may have been a common phenomenon in Asia, if not elsewhere, because it's quite natural for companies or business groups to seek favor from the country's government when property rights are strong or weak. What will be interesting to explore further is how the connection words in certain Asian countries differ from one another, and why the connection words in these countries became different. Is it because of the institution or other reason? What do the three and what do these differences imply for economic development of the respective countries involved? It will also be interesting to do a comparative study that includes Asian countries where the business groups do not play important roles in the economy. One such economy is Taiwan. Unlike Korea, the government's relations with industry in Taiwan have been more distant. Additionally, perhaps because of that, industrial structure in Taiwan is characterized by a more dominant SME sector. With regard to innovation, Taiwan spent relatively high R&D. In 2021, Taiwan spent 3.77% of its GDP on R&D, the third largest after Israel and Korea. Before I end, regarding the innovation, there are few reasons that may explain the dearth of innovation in Indonesia. R&D expenditure is indeed exceptionally low in Indonesia, only around 0.3% of GDP, compared to 0.8% in GDP in South Korea. However, this is because one, MNC that cooperate in Indonesia do their R&D in their home countries or in other countries instead of Indonesia. The MNC behave this way because Indonesia doesn't have appropriate infrastructure such as laboratories to conduct R&D. Compared to South Korea, the level of human capital in Indonesia is also relatively low, too low to do R&D consistently in a large scale. In short, the lack of innovation in Indonesia may be due more to the underlying factors rather than the behavior of the business group or the distorted incentive brought about by the connection word instead. That's my end of my discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond, for the the thoughts regarding the contents of the book, and perhaps what I highlighted here. Basically, when we are talking about this connection world, perhaps well, I know that we are talking about the ASEAN countries, but it seems that there will be like a uniqueness, right? I mean, like the connection world, perhaps it's not 100% compatible or have the same characteristic in all countries in the global context. And perhaps Simon and Saul could expand a bit or could respond to Dr. Raymond's insights regarding the book. And perhaps if you have a further comments on Dr. Raymond, it will be great if we could discuss it in this forum. And perhaps we also have participant that I will give an opportunity to ask directly later on after Simon and also Saul give the feedback to Dr. Raymond. Simon or Saul, please, I will give you a time to respond or give a comment what Dr. Raymond just shared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me start briefly, and first by thanking Pak Raymond for some really excellent comments, and I hope the slides and the presentation will encourage you to get the book. I have to say, by the way, for those of you who might be interested, whether for good or bad, I'm not quite sure, but I'm afraid that probably Amazon is the best way of getting it. There is a link that you've attached, which Cambridge University Press, you can get it through, but I suspect it will be much a longer process. Anyhow, to the more substantive side, you're right, of course, Dr. Raymond, that business groups, family business groups, are not just unique to Asia. They exist in other countries, albeit in slightly different format. But I do feel that family business groups have a depth and a persistence in Asia that is quite unusual. In the various presentations we've made around the world, one of the comparators that has come up is Latin America. And it's certainly true that in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and the like, the major economies, Chile, there are family business groups. And this is an important format for organization. But I would say, actually, the direction of change, if anything, has been to dilute their incidence and their power over time. And this is certainly, I think, really quite different from what we see in Asia. And as Saul mentioned in passing, and in the slideshow, there's a slide about this, it really is terribly interesting to see what you might call an insurgent business group, which is that of Gautam Adani in India, the Adani group. It's very interesting to see how that group has formed and its dynamics. Essentially, Mr. Adani was a relatively minor businessman 15 or 20 years ago. His rise has been extraordinarily rapid and extraordinarily successful. And I think there's absolutely no doubt that a lot of that rise has been related to the connections that he has managed to form with the now dominant political party in India, and indeed its leader, the Prime Minister of India. Now, what's so fascinating is not just that those connections have been leveraged to such good effect, but of course, the group has been set up as a family-based business group. And in fact, the Hindenburg report, Hindenburg being a short seller from New York, that then came out in January of this year, one of the points it really picked up on was the highly non-transparent, opaque governance of this group. Now, we would argue that it's no accident that Adani chose this route and this institutional and other formats. And that's a testimony, I think, to the persistence. Now, you're absolutely right when you say that the weight of business groups or the view of business groups has changed over time. In the 1970s, and indeed in all the economics literature, which Pak Raymond, you and I are all familiar with, about the developmental state, we thought of, as you rightly say, the chaebols as being drivers of development, of national growth, national champions and the like. And there's much value in that view of them. But as you rightly say, in a sense, the main political and policy challenge in South Korea now is how actually to rein in or restructure the economic environment in a way that is less beneficial to these chaebols. And I think this is a perfect metaphor for what can occur and why in the book, Saul and I really signal that this is something looking forward that we should be worried about. because the problem in South Korea is that not that Samsung is just what we might call a lotus eater, a rent taker. Samsung is a highly dynamic, highly successful company that competes internationally. Very innovative as well. But Samsung is also being shown to have remarkable capacity for entrenching itself in the domestic economy. And so South Korea's problem is that you can build powerful companies, and it's particularly intelligent to do so when you expose them to international competition. But the flip side is, of course, that they end up with huge amounts of market power, as Dr. Raymond pointed out, and that market power not only, in a sense, suppresses other sources of innovation in the economy, it also concentrates risk, because if Samsung, for whatever reason, makes the wrong business decisions, the implications for the South Korean economy will be very large. And as Dr. Raymond also pointed out, it leads to moral entanglements of an undesirable nature, not least of all corruption and other. And now you really make a nice point about Taiwan. We don't actually deal with Taiwan in its current incarnation in the book, and that's a very significant point that you make. I mean, there are obviously a couple of major Taiwanese companies, TCMS and the like, but you're right. There's a much more variegated environment of business structures and sizes there. I think I'll hand over to Saul, if that's all right, to deal with some of the other points, not least of all on innovation.
Well, thank you, and Dr. Raymond. I mean, that was a really very, very helpful set of comments and points, and I learned a lot actually. I also found the comment on Taiwan very helpful, but actually most interesting in a funny way to me was getting some real depth on how you saw Indonesia and business groups in Indonesia, and I think I learned a lot from that. A few reactions. I think Simon's picked up a lot. I don't think that we really differ that much. I completely agree with your fundamental point, which is that business groups are affiliations of firms. Firms are interested in profit, especially in developing countries. The government is a huge player. And as a result of that, it's not at all surprising that we see relationships between government and business. We're really not, we would have no disagreement with that. It is the case in most developing countries that the government plays a bigger role in the economy and that government business relations are higher. I think our point is slightly different. What distinguishes Asia in our view, because of course there are business groups, as Simon has mentioned, in Latin America, and as you have mentioned, of course there are big business groups in Russia. What distinguishes Asia is that business groups in Asia, the connections world in Asia is associated with really rather fast development. Whereas of course, that is not what's going on in Russia, and that's not really what's going on for the most part in Latin America. And we would argue that the reason for that is twofold. The first is that the Asian economies, not all of them, but most of them, have essentially adopted export-led development strategies. You said this yourself about Indonesia. Export-led strategies and activist vertical industrial policies. And the second is that we believe that the connections world has been beneficial in this because it basically allows coordination. I mean, a lot of people, people like Danny Roderick and so forth, view the problem of development in part as problems of coordination of infrastructure and the provision of public goods and addressing market failures. And the business group arrangement, which does allow coordination across sectors, because of the nature of business groups, and the role of government within that, seems to be, if not a completely uniquely, then a largely uniquely Asian characteristic, and one which has worked very well for Asia. And we're really not arguing it's not worked well. Our argument is this: it's worked well till now, but what has been a positive feature may become a negative feature. And you, in your own discussion, have highlighted what we all have also noted, which is the most advanced country in the Asia region, which is South Korea, itself understands that this is a potential problem. I think you actually pointed out exactly our view, which is that the South Koreans, the government helped to build the chaebols to push development forward, but now they're trying to develop an SME sector in order to transform the economy from a export-led manufacturing towards a process of much higher levels of innovation. And it's innovation which is the concern of the South Koreans. So let us turn to innovation for a moment. Now, I don't think there's anything, again, I don't think we disagree greatly. I found it particularly interesting, your argument on why innovation was low in Indonesia. It's very striking how low innovation is in Asia in Indonesia by Asian standards. It's really one of the only countries with the Philippines which is well below the line. I think our book is about asking the question, if business groups concentrate so many resources, you would expect them to be at or above the line that I showed before. Now, what we see is that they're not above the line, except South Korea. So that the benefits we get for extensive growth in terms of coordinating resources, we don't get for innovation for the most part. What I think you've added to our story, and it was really useful, is an understanding that within Asia, there's variation in terms of capacity for innovation. And your argument was essentially about infrastructure and human capital. And how Indonesia is perhaps weaker in innovation, in R&D, than other Asian countries because of deficiencies in those areas. And that seems to me to highlight a really important area for policy going forward.
Okay, thank you for the reactions to Simon and also Saul. And perhaps we still have plenty of time to give an opportunity to the audience, to the participants. So I just want to report that, we have more than 30 participants join in the Zoom, and perhaps, there will be more in our YouTube channel. And perhaps, we already have two participants that willing, if you don't mind, Simon and Saul, we have two participants or two audience that would like to, ask the questions directly to both of you. I think I will give an opportunity to Mr. Muhammad Ismail Sunni to give to ask the questions to the authors, especially regarding the content of the book, and perhaps if you have a question regarding the content itself. Mr. Sunni, please, time and screen is yours.
Thank you, Pak Fajar, as the chair of this event. And I would like to also thank to the two presenters that we have in this afternoon.
Could you introduce yourself first?
My name is Muhammad Ismail Sunni. I'm a postgraduate student in economics major of Indonesia Islam International University. This time around, I'd like to look forward to the comparative response from the two presenters. Okay, so I fully realized that Asia, despite having some developed countries like South Korea or Japan, that lead Asia's economic. However, majority are developing countries, like one of them is Indonesia, which most of them are either Islamic countries or countries with biggest population of Muslim. There are a total of 49 countries in Asia. Out of these, 26 countries have a majority Muslim populations, while the remaining 23 countries have a non-Muslim majority population. Now, I would like to also you to consider there is an axis faith-based organization, which are entities dedicated to specific religious identities, often including a social or moral component. Even the World Bank recognizes their distinct strategic value, given their unique attributes, including the fact that more than 80% of the world's population claims religious affiliation. So the question is that, do you think religiosity could be another principal determinant in current Asian business connection or Asian economics that should be taken into account, realizing that one of the most noticeable characteristics of developing countries is political instability, in which role of religion is quite significant in determining the directions of both economic and politics of these countries. The second question, will religiosity also be a prevailing currency for the future of Asia business connection? What about religion-based or faith-based business group? Do you think that they also could play a significant role, not only impacting overall schemes of Asia business connection, but also specifically deterring predators of both political and business? That's my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sunny. Perhaps Pak Simon as also Saul could get the question from Mr. Sunny. Well, the things that I got from the question from Mr. Sunny is about well, it's about, is there any is the religiosity or the religious issue also could impact this business ties or the connection work that you are explaining to us in your books. And perhaps well, if you have reactions or response to Mr. Sani, please, I will give you a chance to respond, Simon and so on.
Maybe I should start on this. I'm sure Simon will add in a moment. If you think back to the work of Douglas North, who really introduced the idea of institutions and the role of institutions to economic development, Douglas North distinguishes between two categories of institution. Formal institutions, these are the laws and the rules and what he calls the rules of the game, and informal institutions, which are more the culture and the norms and so on and so forth. And one, not the only, but one of the most important of the informal institutions in the North sense is religion. So I could rephrase your question as saying, what is the current and what will be the future role of informal institutions in this particular characterization, the Connections World characterization of Asian economies? This is, of course, an enormous question, Mr. Sunny, and I don't really pretend I can give a simple-minded answer to this. What I would say, however, is this, that I think many economists would take the view that for the operation of the economy, as countries become more developed, formal institutions and the change in formal institutions play an ever-increasing role. So informal institutions like religion are very important, and they provide, so to speak, a cultural backdrop. They provide a specificity to how the economy works, which is perhaps always there. But as an economy becomes more developed, the particular rules and laws and arrangements, I think, would become of increasing significance. So it seems to me that the way I would answer your question would be to say that I think that the way the connections world operates let's go back for a moment. One of the things we've sought to do in our book is the opposite of what Dr. Raymond was trying to do, right? Dr. Raymond was saying, what factors drive the differences in Asia in the operation of the connections world? Now, that's actually a very good question. But what we tried to do in our book was to try and establish the commonalities, which was the connections world. Seems to us that the differences logically come after you've established the commonalities, right? And there seems no doubt that religion is going to lead to differences between countries in the way that the connections world plays out. It almost certainly leads to connection differences right now. If you get a chance to look at our book, you'll see that countries like Pakistan, which are Muslim, the connections world, even though they come from, in other ways, common institutional arrangements from the colonial era, obviously that's a long time ago now, though they come from common institutional roots, India and Pakistan, the connections world play out somewhat. There's a connection world in both, but they play out somewhat differently. So I do think religion might be a basis for understanding differences between Asian countries. As for going forwards, however, which you asked two questions, so that's my answer to your first question. Your second question, as for going forward, my feeling is that it will become not more but less important because of the increasing role of formal institutions. I don't know whether Simon wants to add anything.
Okay, thank you, Saul. And please, Pak Simon, if you want to respond.
No, I think I'll leave it. I think that's a very good reply. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I noticed that a couple of good questions on the Q&A that have been posted as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sami. Now, I think I will give an opportunity to other participants who would like to ask the questions. Perhaps Mr. Jeremy Samuel. Sam, are you there? Yeah, so I think, Sam, you can ask directly to Pak Simon and also Saul regarding your question. Please, Sam.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm full disclosure, I'm a research assistant in CSIS. So yeah, but yeah, I found the presentation to be very interesting because business groups are a big part of the Suharto era, and no one really likes to talk about the Suharto era, at least to the nitty-gritty of it. So it's nice to have the both of you spark a discussion on that. And one of the things that we like to talk about the Suharto era is corruption, and it's not really mentioned explicitly during the presentation. We know that you said that business groups and the government have a transactional relationship. I scratch you, you scratch my back, but does not necessarily mean that they do it in an illegal way, or at least that's the tone I heard from the slide. So I wanted to ask a simple clarification question as my first question. Does the presence of a connections world, as introduced by the book, always lead to corruption, or is it possible for a connections world to exist without corruption being present? So for example, like South Korea did not seem to have overt corruption, at least to the point that the business groups seem to be more disciplined compared to the ones in Indonesia, less rent seeking and stuff. Yeah, that's my first question.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Pak Simon, if you want to respond, Sam's question.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I'll come in on that. That's a very good question. Is there a very tight correlation between corruption and this form of business organization? Well, we don't explore that formally. I mean, we don't apply any statistical analysis to this relationship, but I think probably from the large number of cases that we use in the book, the unfortunate answer is that there probably is quite a tight correlation. You mentioned South Korea. I mean, the current chairman of Samsung has been in jail on corruption on several occasions, was only released quite recently. And as Pak Raymond mentioned, quite a few of the presidents themselves have been jailed or convicted of corruption. So I don't think it's inevitable. After all, some business groups have managed to perform as business groups, as very successful ones, and largely untainted by corruption. I mean, in the Indian context, I think most people would argue that Tata Sons has been a fairly exemplary business group, and certainly corruption has not been something associated with it. But other business groups in that country, as elsewhere, have been. So I would say that the moral hazards of this form of business organization are quite high.
Okay, thank you, Pak Simon. Saul, do you want to have additional comments on that?
No, we don't. As Simon said, it's a very good question, but we haven't done the relevant empirical work. I mean, I think, you know, the only thing to underline is what Simon's already said, which is that the connections world is about a close relationship, a purposive, transactional, close relationship between business groups and the government. Those transactions may be corrupt and may not, and we haven't really perhaps given enough thought to what might lead them to be corrupt, but there's no necessity for them to be corrupt. It's not, corruption is not inherent in the connections world. I mean, I really would want to stress that we regard, at least looking backwards, the connections world on balance as a positive, not a negative thing.
Okay, thank you, Saul. Is there any other questions or participant who want to ask a question? I think that's the last question from Mr. Jeremy Samuel, right? Okay, so well, I believe that the most important thing that I think you should read the book, and perhaps, you know, like you could find it somewhere in the you know, you can purchase the book online, or also if you could find it in your local bookstore. I think it will be grateful, you know, like if you could have a chance to read the book directly. So again, thank you, Simon, and also thank you, Saul, and of course, the most important, thank you, Dr. Raymond, for the insight. Perhaps, you know, we can conclude this, you know, like book discussion webinar by thanking all of you who joined us through the Zoom and also our YouTube channel. And perhaps, you know, like you can gain a valuable insight about the challenges and opportunities facing in ASEAN capitalism in the context of globalization and digitalization. Well, to conclude, I believe that this book offers a unique perspective on how the evolution of global networks and the technology is shaping the futures of ASEAN capitalism. Perhaps, you know, like we highly recommend this book to anyone who wants to deepen their knowledge of the region's economic landscape and its future prospects. And you can, like I mentioned to you before, you can purchase the book online, and I think Saul already sent a link in the chat box before, or if you could find it in your local bookstore, it will be great as well. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again with our next book discussion. Thank you, Pak Simon. Thank you, Saul, and also thank you, Dr. Raymond.
Thank you very much. We much appreciated it. It was great.